He rode up to her new home like a man who had swallowed fire and was burning alive from the inside out. Amos Doyle pulled his horse to a hard stop in front of the freshly painted white fence, the animal's hooves throwing up a spray of dry Texas dust that caught the last copper light of the evening sun. His chest heaved. His dark eyes were wild with something she had never seen on his proud face before, not in all the years she had known him, not in all the arguments and silences and longing glances she had catalogued in the private museum of her broken heart. He looked desperate. He looked undone. He looked like a man who had ridden 60 miles without stopping and didn't care one lick that his good gray horse was trembling beneath him. Cora Hart stood on the porch of her new home, her husband's home, technically, and her hand went still on the broom she had been sweeping with. The evening air tasted of cedar and coming rain. Behind her, through the open front door, came the smell of supper cooking on the iron stove. A new life. A safe life. A life she had chosen deliberately and with great care, after she had finally accepted what every aching night had tried to teach her, that Amos Doyle was never going to come for her. And now here he was. His hat was pushed back on his head. His dark hair was damp at the temples. Sweat had cut pale lines through the dust on his sharp jaw, and his hands, those big, capable, cattleman's hands, were white-knuckled on the reins as he stared at her from the other side of that fence like a man who had just ridden to the edge of everything he had ever been too proud to say. "Tell me I am not too late," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. Amos Doyle, who had never cracked for anything in his life. Amos Doyle, who had once stared down a trail boss twice his size without so much as blinking. Amos Doyle, who had swallowed grief and fury and longing for 3 years without ever once letting any of it reach his face. Cora's hand tightened on the broomstick until her knuckles matched his. The silence between them stretched like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Inside the house, the supper pot rattled on its hook. Outside, a mockingbird sang 2 notes and went quiet, as if even the birds understood that something enormous was happening in the long gold light of this October evening in 1878. She looked at him. He looked at her. And the whole terrible, beautiful, complicated wreckage of 3 years rose between them like water behind a dam. She had not seen it coming. That was the cruelest part. She had not seen any of it coming. Not the beginning, not the end. Not this moment standing on another man's porch with another man's ring on her finger, and the only man she had ever truly loved sitting on a horse outside her gate with his heart in his hands and ruin in his eyes. It had all started 3 years ago in the spring of 1875 in the small but growing cattle town of Myra Creek, Texas, when Cora Hart first arrived on the westbound stage from Memphis, Tennessee, carrying 1 trunk, 1 carpetbag, a letter of employment from a merchant named Dalton Webb, and absolutely no plan for what her life was going to become. She had been 22 years old. She had just buried her mother. She had no family left and no money beyond what she carried and no particular optimism about the future. But she had been raised by a woman who believed that forward motion was the only cure for grief, and so forward she had gone, all the way to Texas, which seemed about as far forward as a person could reasonably go. Myra Creek was exactly what the territory promised: raw, loud, smelling of cattle and leather and possibility, with a main street made of packed earth and ambition, where the buildings were still new enough that you could smell the fresh lumber on hot afternoons. The stage depot sat across from the land office, which sat next to the Asher, which sat next to 3 saloons in a row because in 1875 in cattle country, a man's thirst was considered at least as important as his legal business. Cora had stepped off the stage with mud on the hem of her traveling dress and grit in her eyes and looked at all of it without flinching. Dalton Webb's dry goods store was a solid place, well stocked, with a counter that ran the length of the south wall and shelves that went to the ceiling, and a ladder on a rolling track that Cora was expected to climb at least 6 times a day to retrieve bolts of fabric or tins of tobacco, or any of the thousand small necessities that kept a frontier town breathing. She was good at the work. She had a memory like a well-organized cabinet, could calculate prices faster than Webb himself, and had a manner with difficult customers that smoothed over arguments before they became scenes. Webb paid her fairly, housed her in the small room above the store, and within 2 months told her she was the best clerk he had ever employed, which she thanked him for calmly and went back to inventorying the flour sacks. She had met Amos Doyle on a Thursday in June of that same year, 6 weeks after her arrival, when he had come into the store smelling of horse and open range and looked at her across the counter with those dark, assessing eyes and said, without any particular ceremony, that he needed 30 pounds of salt, a new set of hobble straps, and to know if the store had started carrying a particular brand of cartridges. "We carry Winchester," she had said. "We don't carry sharps in that caliber, but I can put in an order if you'll leave your name and come back in 2 weeks. He had studied her for a moment. "You're new," he said. "I am," she said. "Do you want the cartridges ordered?" He had smiled then, not a big smile, nothing showy, just a slight upward movement at the corner of his mouth, the kind of smile that a man who was used to keeping himself controlled allowed himself when something genuinely surprised him. "Yes," he said. "Amos Doyle." The Double D spread 7 miles east on the Myra Creek Road. "I know the road," she said, though she didn't, not yet. "I'll have them for you in 2 weeks, Mr. Doyle." She had charged him for his salt and his hobble straps, and he had paid without haggling, which Webb later told her made him notable among the cattlemen who came through the store, since most of them argued about the price of everything as a matter of principle rather than actual need. Amos Doyle paid what things cost and asked for what he needed and went away without making a scene. And in Cora's first weeks in Myra Creek, she had learned to appreciate a man who knew how to behave in public. He came back for his cartridges in 2 weeks, and then he began coming in every few weeks after that, sometimes for supplies, sometimes with a list from his ranch foreman, once or twice for things so small a spool of thread, a tin of boot polish, that even Cora's well-organized mind had to wonder whether the supplies were strictly the point. She did not let herself wonder about it too much. She had come to Texas to build a life, not to fall into one of the oldest traps a woman could fall into on a frontier, believing that a man's attention was a promise of something more. She had seen enough of that in Memphis, seen enough women reshape themselves around a man's interest, only to discover that interest was not the same thing as intention, and she had resolved before she ever stepped onto the westbound stage that she would not be one of those women. And yet, there was something about Amos Doyle that made resolution feel like a smaller thing than she had thought it was. He was proud, that much was obvious from the first. He wore his success plainly, but without apology. The Double D was one of the largest spreads in the county, built over 15 years of work that had started with a single land claim, and 200 cattle and grown into something that other men in Myra Creek spoke of with a mixture of respect and envy. He was 30 years old when she met him, broad through the shoulders, with a face that the sun and the wind had carved into something angular and severe that became something else entirely when he allowed himself to be relaxed. He was a man who had opinions and expressed them without aggression and listened when others spoke, which in a cattle town in 1875 put him in a small and distinguished category. He was also, she discovered over the slow accumulation of Thursday afternoons and supply orders and incidental conversations across the counter, a man who was genuinely interested in the world beyond the range of his cattle operation. He had books at the Double D Real Books, not just almanacs and land survey records but actual literature, and he read them. And he had opinions about what he read that he shared with a directness that Cora found both startling and refreshing. He asked her opinions about things and then actually listened to her answers, which in 1875 in a cattle town was almost as rare as an ice storm in August. She began to look forward to Thursdays. She told herself it was because Thursday was supply day for most of the ranches, and the store was busy, and she liked being busy. She told herself this with great firmness every Wednesday night, and on Thursday mornings she brushed her hair more carefully than usual and told herself it was because presentation mattered in the service trade. She was 22 years old and she had been lonely for a long time, and she was not, it turned out, quite as armored as she had believed herself to be. The first time they had a real conversation, not a business transaction dressed as conversation, but an actual exchange between two people who were interested in each other as human beings, was in late August of 1875, when a late afternoon thunderstorm rolled through Myra Creek so fast and so hard that the street outside flooded knee-deep within 20 minutes, and Amos Doyle was stranded in the store for the better part of 2 hours waiting for it to pass. Webb had gone home early that day with a head cold, leaving Cora to manage the store alone, and when the storm hit and the door banged open and Amos came inside shaking water from his hat like a dog, they had looked at each other and then at the roaring gray wall of water outside the window. And then Cora had gone to the back and made coffee on the small stove she used for exactly these kinds of occasions, and brought 2 cups out to the counter and set one in front of him without asking. He had looked at the coffee and then at her with that slight, contained smile. "Thank you," he said. "The storm will pass in an hour," she said. "It usually does." "You've been here 2 months," he said. "You've learned the weather already." "I've learned that the weather here is its own personality," she said. "Dramatic but short-tempered," he laughed. An actual laugh, warm and real, and she felt it somewhere in the center of her chest like a struck bell. They had talked for 2 hours. About books. She was reading a worn copy of Jane Eyre that she had brought from Memphis, and he had read it too, which surprised her enough that she said so. And he said his mother had sent it to him years ago, and he had read it because he had been snowbound for a week, and it was that or the Land Survey records, and he had found it considerably more interesting than he had expected. About Texas, which she was still learning to love. About Memphis, which he had never been to but had heard about. About cattle prices, which he explained to her with the patience of a man who understood that not everyone had spent their life on the range, and about the dry goods trade, which she explained to him with the same patience. When the storm ended and the street outside began to drain and he stood up to go, he hesitated with his hat in his hands in a way she had not seen him hesitate before and said, "Miss Hart, would you be willing to have supper with me sometime? At the hotel dining room, if that suits you." She had looked at him for a moment, all her well-maintained resolutions rising up like a chorus, and then she had said, "Yes, Mr. Doyle, I think I would." They had supper at the Myra Creek Hotel dining room on the following Saturday, and it was the first of many suppers over the next year, and each one was better than the last, richer in conversation and laughter, and the particular pleasure of 2 people discovering that the world is more interesting when seen through another person's eyes. He took her riding one Sunday afternoon in September, lending her one of his calmer horses, and riding beside her through the golden autumn grass of the Double D, with the kind of quiet contentment that some men show only when they are on their own land, and in company they genuinely want. She fell in love with him somewhere in that autumn, though she could not have named the exact moment any more than you can name the exact moment when day becomes evening. It simply happened, the way things that have been building for months simply happen, all at once and everywhere, until you realize that the feeling has been there for a long time, and you have simply been too afraid to call it by its name. She believed during those autumn months that he was falling in love with her too. She had evidence. Not just the suppers and the rides and the conversations, but smaller things. The way his face changed when she walked into a room. The way he remembered small things she had mentioned weeks earlier and brought them back into conversation in ways that showed he had been thinking about them. The way he reached across the table sometimes to touch her hand when he was making a point, and then left his hand there a moment longer than making a point required. She believed all of this evidence. She believed in it the way a person believes in something they need to be true. And then, in the spring of 1876, Amos Doyle rode 100 miles to San Antonio for a cattle show and came back engaged to a woman named Vivienne Aldrich. Cora heard about it from Mabel Prout at the post office, who told her with the particular mixture of sympathy and relish that people use when delivering news they know will cause pain to the recipient. Vivienne Aldrich was the daughter of Franklin Aldrich, who was the largest cattle baron in the San Antonio district, and whose spread made even the Double D look modest. She was beautiful, or so Mabel had heard from someone who had seen her, and she was accomplished, and the match was exactly the kind of strategic alliance that expanded empires and secured futures and made very good sense from the outside looking in. Cora had thanked Mabel for the information and walked back to the store and gone up to her room and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time with her hands folded in her lap, feeling the walls of the life she had been carefully, cautiously building around a hope she had never let herself fully acknowledge crumble quietly around her. She had been such a fool. She had known better, and she had done it anyway. She had put her chin up and she had gone on, because forward motion was what her mother had taught her, and because she was not the kind of woman who let other people's choices lay her flat. But she had put something away that spring, something that she had been carrying carefully for almost a year, and she packed it into the same interior cabinet where she kept all the things she could not afford to look at, and she locked it and tried her best to leave it there. Amos had come into the store the following Thursday, and he had been exactly himself, direct, calm, neither awkward nor overly careful, and he had said, "I expect you've heard about Vivienne Aldrich." Not an apology, not an explanation, just the statement. "I have," Cora said. "Congratulations." He had looked at her for a moment with something in his face that she refused to read because reading it would not do either of them any good. "She's a fine woman," he said. "Good family. The match makes sense." "I'm sure it does," Cora said. She charged him for his supplies and he paid and he went away. And that was the end of whatever it was that had existed between them in that golden autumn, or at least that was what she told herself. Vivienne Aldrich came to Myra Creek in June of 1876, and she was exactly as described: beautiful, accomplished, with city manners and expensive clothes, and an air of cool confidence that Cora watched from across the street and felt nothing about, or tried her very best to feel nothing about. She and Amos were married in September, a large wedding at the Myra Creek church that the entire town was invited to. And Cora went because not going would have been conspicuous. And she wore her best blue dress, and she smiled at everyone, and she shook Vivienne's hand, and said she hoped they would be very happy, and meant it as genuinely as a person can mean something that also hurts. She had turned her attention, over the months that followed, to the business of her own life with a kind of fierce, focused energy that surprised even herself. She worked harder at the store and saved more carefully and read more books and made friends, real friends. Not just the surface friendships of a woman who is new in a place, but the kind of deep, honest friendships that come from being known. She became good friends with a woman named Ruth Calloway, who ran the town's small infirmary with her doctor husband, and with the school teacher, a sharp-minded woman named Grace Finney, who had come from Ohio and shared Cora's opinion that the West was full of possibility if you were stubborn enough to claim it. She did not think about Amos Doyle any more than she could help, which was to say she thought about him regularly and hated herself for it. She saw him in town, of course. Myra Creek was not large enough for avoidance. They spoke when they encountered each other with the careful politeness of two people who have put something very fragile down in a specific place and are both committed to not going near it. He was civil. She was civil. It was perfectly awful. In the spring of 1877, 8 months after the wedding, Vivienne Doyle fell ill. The illness was mysterious at first, a cough that didn't resolve, a fatigue that went beyond what the social demands of a new wife in a new town could account for. Dr. Calloway examined her in April and sent to San Antonio for a specialist. And the specialist came in May and gave a diagnosis that Ruth Calloway told Cora about in a low, careful voice. Consumption. The kind that had progressed far enough that treatment was more comfort than cure. Cora had felt the news like a blow. She had not wanted Vivienne Doyle to be ill. She had not wanted any such thing. Whatever dark feeling she had wrestled within herself, she was not a woman who wanted another person to suffer, and she pushed away any complicated emotion that tried to attach itself to the information and thought instead, with genuine sadness, about a young woman who had come to a new place and married a man she was just beginning to know and was now going to leave both very quickly. Vivienne Doyle died in October of 1877. She had been 24 years old. She and Amos had been married just over a year. The town mourned her with the genuine kindness that small communities show toward the young dead, and Amos bore it with the rigid, terrifying composure of a man who had decided that falling apart was not something he was permitted to do. He kept running the Double D, he kept paying his accounts at the store. He kept showing up in town when business required it. But there was something different about him now, a stillness that was too still, a quietness that sat in his eyes like a stone at the bottom of a well. Cora had written him a condolence letter. Formal, correct, sincere. He had sent a brief note in return thanking her for her kindness. That was all. She had continued to live her life. She had saved her money and thought about her future and had 2 or 3 conversations with a decent, quiet man named Henry Marsh, who was a lawyer newly arrived in Myra Creek from Kansas City, who had kind eyes and steady hands and no dangerous attraction whatsoever, which she told herself was exactly what she wanted. And then, gradually, quietly, over the winter of 1877 and into the spring of 1878, Amos Doyle had begun to come into the store on Thursdays again. At first it was only for supplies, businesslike and brief, but then the conversations began to lengthen. Then he began to linger after his transaction was done, leaning on the counter with his hat in his hand, talking about the weather and then about the range and then about books and then about the things that mattered. And Cora, who should have known better and did know better and found knowing better to be completely inadequate armor against the experience of him standing 3 feet away being himself, found herself looking forward to Thursdays again. She was afraid of it. She was honest enough with herself to be deeply, seriously afraid of it. She had survived the last 2.5 years by building a carefully structured interior life that did not depend on Amos Doyle's attention, and she did not want to let it depend on that again. She had seen what happened when she let it depend on that. So she was careful. She was pleasant and warm and engaged in conversation and carefully, deliberately held something back, keeping a measured distance behind her eyes that she hoped he didn't notice. He noticed. On a Thursday in late April of 1878, he stayed later than usual, and the other customers had all gone, and the afternoon light was going gold and long through the store windows, and he looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read and said, "Cora, I feel like I've been trying to talk to you for months and there's a glass wall between us. Like you're there, but also very deliberately not there." She had been arranging tobacco tins on a shelf and she went still, not turning around because she needed a moment she knew she didn't have. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "I think you do," he said. She turned around then and looked at him squarely, because she was not a woman who hid from things when they were standing directly in front of her, no matter how much she wanted to. "Amos," she said, "what exactly is it that you want to say?" He had looked at her with those dark eyes for a long, charged moment, and then he had done something she hadn't expected. He had closed his mouth and looked away, and when he looked back his face was composed again, locked back into the pride and control that were as much a part of him as his hands. "I'm sorry," he said. "You're right. I'll see you next Thursday, Miss Hart." And he put his hat on and walked out, and she had stood in the store in the long gold light and felt something in her chest crack very quietly. After that, she had made a decision. She had spent that evening with Henry Marsh, who invited her to the hotel dining room for supper as he had been doing occasionally for 2 months, and who was kind and reliable and safe, and who looked at her with uncomplicated admiration that never sent her emotions into the turbulent territory that a single glance from Amos Doyle could navigate her into without even trying. Henry asked her, over supper that April evening, if she might consider him seriously as a prospective husband, and she had thought about it for 3 days and then said yes. They were engaged in May of 1878. Henry purchased a piece of land 3 miles east of town and hired a builder. The house was finished in September. They were married on the first Saturday of October by the same reverend who had married Amos and Vivienne 2 years before, in the same little church, and Cora had worn a different dress but had walked the same aisle and stood before the same altar and said words that she believed she meant. Henry Marsh was a good man. She wanted to be clear about that in her own heart and mind in the years that followed and in the telling of this story. He was genuinely good, patient and kind and honest, a man who treated her with respect and tried to make her happy and deserved someone who could love him without reservation. She was trying. She was trying very hard. She had been Mrs. Henry Marsh for exactly 2 weeks, living in her new home with its fresh white paint and its porch and its smell of new wood and new life. When Amos Doyle rode up to her gate in the copper light of an October evening and pulled his horse to a hard stop and said, with his voice cracking and his eyes wild with everything he had swallowed for 3 years, "Tell me I am not too late." She looked at him across the fence with Henry's ring on her finger and her hands tight on the broomstick and the supper pot rattling on the stove behind her, and she said nothing, because she did not know what to say. Because there were 17 different things she needed to say, and not one of them was simple, and not one of them was safe, and not one of them could be said on a porch in the open air 2 weeks into a marriage that she had agreed to with her eyes open. "Amos," she finally said. Her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "Henry is inside." He didn't move. His horse shifted under him and he stilled it with one hand and kept looking at her. "I know," he said. "I know it's wrong to be here. I know I have no right. I rode here anyway because—" He stopped. He looked at the sky for a moment, jaw tight, and then he looked back at her. "Because I have been a coward for 3 years and I cannot be a coward anymore. Whatever the consequence is, I cannot be a coward anymore. You being here is a consequence," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "I know." The front door opened behind her. Henry Marsh stood in the doorway, a solid, calm man of 31 with a lawyer's measured way of assessing a situation. He looked at Amos Doyle on the horse and then at Cora's face and then back at Amos, and the calculation in his quiet eyes was painful to witness because it was so fast and so accurate. "Mr. Doyle," Henry said, "not hostile, just precise." "Mr. Marsh," Amos said, "I apologize for coming unannounced. What do you want?" Henry asked, still not hostile, just a man who needed an honest answer. Amos looked at Cora. "To say things I should have said a long time ago," he said. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm not here to make demands. He stopped again. The proud mask cracked again. "I need her to know what I should have told her." There was a silence that contained everything, all the mistakes and mischances and wrong turns and deliberate choices that had brought 3 people to this porch on this October evening in 1878. Henry said to Cora quietly, "Do you want to hear what he has to say?" She looked at her husband, the good, patient man she had married 2 weeks ago. She looked at him and the decency in his face was so complete that it made her chest hurt. "Henry," she said. "I see your face," he said simply. "I've been seeing your face for 6 months. Answer the question, Cora. Do you want to hear him?" She looked at Amos. She looked at his hands on the reins and his eyes on her face and the 3 years of accumulated silence in every line of his body, and she said, "Yes." Henry nodded once slowly. He said nothing else. He stepped back inside and closed the door, and the sound of it closing was one of the loneliest sounds Cora had ever heard. She walked down the porch steps. She walked to the fence. She stopped with the white painted rail between her and Amos, and she looked up at him from the ground and waited. He swung down from the horse and tied it to the fence post and faced her, hat in hand, and the sun was almost gone now, and the air was turning cold, and the shadows were long, and the two of them stood at the fence in the dusk of the Texas evening, and he said, "I have been in love with you since that storm in August of 1875. I knew it then, and I was afraid of it. I was afraid because you were someone I could actually lose, not just want and move on from, but actually love in the kind of way that changes everything, and I didn't know what to do with that. And I was proud. I was so damn proud, Cora. I thought I could manage it. I thought I could keep it controlled and safe and make the reasonable choice, and that would be enough." "You went to San Antonio," she said. "I went to San Antonio," he said, "and I told myself it was sensible. Vivienne was a fine woman and the match made sense, and I thought if I built something solid and practical, the feeling would diminish, manage itself. I was wrong about everything." "She died," Cora said. "She died," he said. "And I carry that. I carry that she deserved a husband whose whole heart was in it, and she didn't have that. And I carry it every day. And I am not here to use her death as a reason for anything. But after she was gone, I could see things more clearly, and the thing I could see most clearly was you. And I was still afraid. I was afraid you had moved on, afraid you had good reason to have moved on, afraid I'd waited too long, afraid of what it meant that I'd waited this long." "So you kept waiting," she said. "I kept waiting," he said. "And while I was waiting, you said yes to a good man, and I woke up one morning and you were married, and it was every single thing I deserved. I know that. I know exactly what I deserve." He looked at her with those stripped-bare eyes. "I just needed you to know. I don't know what you'll do with it. I don't know what there is to do with it. But I couldn't let it sit inside me another day without you knowing that you were never, that I never stopped." He stopped. He pressed his lips together. "I love you," he said. "I should have told you 3 years ago, and I am sorry that I didn't." She stood at the fence with her hands gripping the top rail, and she looked at him, and the locked cabinet in her chest had all its doors open at once, and everything she had put in there over 3 years was out, and she was standing in the middle of it, and the ring on her left hand was cold in the October air. "You came too late," she whispered. He nodded. His face was still. "I know," he said. "I am married," she said. "To a good man who does not deserve any of this." "I know that too," he said. They stood at the fence in the dark for a long moment, the two of them on either side of it, and she thought about every Thursday afternoon and every careful conversation, and every moment she had held herself back to protect herself from exactly this. And she thought about the supper cooling inside and Henry's quiet, knowing face in the doorway, and she thought about what her life was and what her life could have been and what it was going to be, and she said, "You should go, Amos." He nodded. He picked up his hat. He was turning toward his horse when she said, "But you should also know." He stopped. "You should know," she said, "that you are not the only one who has been carrying something they should have said." He turned back. He looked at her in the last of the light. "I loved you," she said. "I loved you from that autumn, and I never stopped, and I married Henry Marsh because I decided you were never going to say anything, and because I was tired of waiting for a man who couldn't bring himself to be brave. And you should know that, because you deserve to know exactly what your waiting cost both of us." He looked at her, and the pain in his face was so complete that she almost reached through the fence for him. "Go," she said softly. "Please go." He went. She stood at the fence until the sound of his horse faded into the dark, and then she stood there a while longer, and then she went inside. Henry was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands folded in front of him and a cup of cold coffee beside him, and the expression of a man who had already made a decision and was waiting for someone to catch up to it. She sat down across from him. She did not know what to say. He said, "I heard some of it. I didn't mean to. The windows were open." She closed her eyes. "Henry, I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to answer me honestly, because I am a man who can handle an honest answer, even a hard one." She opened her eyes and looked at him. "Do you love him?" he asked. The silence lasted a long time. She looked at her good, patient husband, and she thought about what it meant to be honest in a moment like this, about what honesty cost and what it was worth. Yes, she said. He breathed through it. He looked at his folded hands, then he looked up at her. Have you ever loved me? He asked. I care for you deeply, she said. I admire you. I wanted to build something with you. I thought. She stopped. I thought that the other thing was finished. I thought I had put it away properly. But you hadn't, he said. No, she said. I hadn't. He was quiet for a long time. The lamp flame moved in a draft from under the door, casting wavering shadows on the kitchen wall. I want to tell you something, he said finally, and I want you to hear it without trying to argue me out of it. She waited. I knew, he said simply. I knew when I asked you. I could see something in you that wasn't entirely present, not in a bad way, not in a way that made you anything less than wonderful, but I could see it. I told myself it would change. That time and kindness and a real life together would fill in the space. He paused. I was wrong about that too, I think. Henry, let me finish, he said gently. I am not angry with you. I want you to hear that clearly because it's the truth. You have been nothing but good to me. You have been honest and kind and a better wife than I had any right to expect given the circumstances. But I think we both know that what you said on that porch about loving him and never stopping, that is not something that a good marriage can be built around. Not a good one. Not the kind you deserve. She looked at him and her eyes were bright, and she hated herself for the complication of feeling something like relief, alongside the weight of guilt and grief that was pressing down on her. What are you saying? She asked. I'm saying, Henry said quietly, that I would rather know the truth now than live 10 years inside a beautiful lie. And I am saying that what I want, what I genuinely want, not out of martyrdom but out of actual desire for you to have a full life, is for you to be happy, truly happy, not carefully managing your way through happy. A marriage is not something you simply, in the territory of Texas in 1878, he said almost gently, a marriage can be dissolved in the district court on grounds of mutual incompatibility if both parties agree and no children are involved. I am a lawyer. I know the exact process. He looked at her steadily. I am not saying this in anger. I am saying it because I have been sitting at this table for the last 30 minutes thinking about what kind of man I want to be, and the kind of man I want to be is the kind who tells the truth when the truth matters. She stared at him. You would do that. I would do that, he said. For you, and for myself, honestly, because I don't want a marriage that is a kind arrangement. I want someday, somewhere, something real. She looked at this man she had married, this quiet, decent, clear-eyed man, and she thought that he was perhaps the most genuinely good person she had ever known, and that the tragedy of their situation was not that he was wrong for her but that someone else was so profoundly right. I don't know what to say to you, she said. You don't have to say anything tonight, he said. Think about it, be sure, but don't decide based on what you think is the right answer. Decide based on what is true. She slept that night in the new house with her eyes on the ceiling and her mind moving through everything that had happened and everything that might happen. And in the morning she got up and made breakfast, and she and Henry ate it quietly, and then she walked into town. She went to Ruth Calloway first, because Ruth was the kind of friend who could hear the whole truth without flinching and give you an honest response instead of the comfortable one. She sat in Ruth's small parlor and told her everything, the storm in 1875, and the Thursdays and the autumn and the engagement to Vivienne and 3 years of carefully managing a feeling and Henry's extraordinary speech at the kitchen table and Amos at the fence saying, "Tell me I am not too late." Ruth listened to all of it. Then she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want, Cora? Set aside what you should want and what it looks like and what people will say. What do you actually want?" Cora looked at her hands in her lap. "I want the thing I've wanted for 3 years," she said. "I want Amos. God help me, I want Amos." Ruth nodded. "Then Henry is right," she said. "You need to be honest." "It's not simple," Cora said. "He made a mistake. He waited too long and hurt me badly. What happens when he does that again? When his pride closes him up and I can't reach him?" "You'll fight it out," Ruth said. "That's what people who actually love each other do. They fight. They make mistakes. They say hard things and then they figure it out. That's not a reason not to love someone, Cora. That's just the price of loving someone real. She walked home through the main street of Myra Creek, and she passed the dry goods store where she had spent 3 years learning Texas and Amos Doyle and herself. And she stopped in front of it and looked at the window and thought about all of it, the storm, the coffee, the careful Thursday afternoons, the way he had smiled when she surprised him, the way he had looked at the fence last night with 3 years of swallowed courage in his eyes. She went home and she told Henry what she had decided. He nodded. He was not surprised. He started the paperwork the following week, quietly and without drama, and within 6 weeks the dissolution was complete, legal, clean, recorded in the district court records, and as private as such things could be made in a small town, though of course the town knew. Towns always know. People talked, the way people talked, with the range of reactions from outrage to understanding to that particular frontier pragmatism that recognized that life was short and hard and mistakes were a survival strategy. Cora moved back to the room above the dry goods store, where Webb told her without ceremony that her position was open if she wanted it, and she thanked him and took it. She did not go to Amos. She did not send word. She sat in her room above the store and she waited for 3 things: the dissolution to be finalized, the talk to die down enough that she could think, and something from the man who had ridden to her fence with his heart in his hands. She waited to see if he would come again, now that he knew the truth, now that she had told him she loved him, now that everything was different. She waited to see what Amos Doyle would do when the ground was clear, and there was nothing to stop him but himself. He came on a Thursday, of course. It was late November of 1878, 6 weeks after the night at the fence, 5 days after the dissolution was recorded, and the weather had turned genuinely cold, the kind of Texas cold that surprised people from warmer climates with its sharpness, and the store was empty of other customers, and she heard the bell above the door and looked up, and there he was. He did not have a list. He was not there for supplies. He walked to the counter and put both hands on it and looked at her and said, "I heard." "Did you?" she said. "The whole town has heard," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's generally how it works, Cora." His voice was quiet and steady and entirely different from the cracked, desperate voice at the fence. This was the voice she knew from the Thursday afternoons, from the storm, from the long gold light of autumn conversations. This was the real voice. "I need to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Not are you free or are you available or is there a chance for me? Are you all right? Are you somewhere solid?" She looked at him. It was such an Amos question, now that she thought about it, practical first, careful of her, honest. It was the question a man asked when he was genuinely concerned rather than strategically positioning himself. "I'm solid," she said. "I'm sad for Henry because he deserved better. I'm sad for the mess I made, but I'm solid." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands in the way she knew. "I'm not the same man I was when I went to San Antonio," he said. "I want you to know that, not as an excuse or a sales pitch. Just, I know what I did wrong. I know that I put pride and practicality above the thing that actually mattered. I know I let you wait when you should never have had to wait. I know that Vivienne deserved better than she got, and so did you. And I have thought about all of it every day for the last year and a half, and the conclusion I have arrived at is that the only honest thing I can do is to be here and to tell you the truth and to let you decide." "What truth?" she asked. "That I want to court you properly," he said. "Honestly and openly and with no fog of hesitation or fear or pride. I want to come to supper on Saturdays and ride out on Sunday afternoons and talk about everything we've been talking about in fragments for 3 years, and I want to do all of it with you knowing exactly what my intentions are, which is that I intend, if you'll let me, to ask you to marry me. Not today, not soon. When you're ready and not before. But that is where I am headed, and I want you to know it because I am done managing information and done being afraid and done being anything less than completely honest with you." She looked at him across the counter. The winter light came through the store windows and caught the silver in his dark hair at the temples. He was 33 now, old enough that the life he had lived showed in his face in interesting ways. And she thought about Ruth's words about fighting it out, about the price of loving someone real. "All right," she said. He blinked. "All right, you'll let me court you, or all right, you want me to leave?" "All right, you can come to supper on Saturday," she said, "and we will talk. And you will be honest with me at every single step, Amos. If you feel yourself closing up, you open your mouth and say words. If you are afraid of something, you tell me instead of getting on a horse to San Antonio. If I say something hard, you stay in the room and hear it. Those are my terms." He looked at her with that slight, contained smile, the one she had been cataloging since 1875. "Those are fair terms," he said. "I am a fair woman," she said. He came to supper on Saturday. He came riding on Sunday. He came on Thursdays for supplies that he definitely needed. And he came on Tuesday evening simply because he wanted to. And by December, the whole of Myra Creek had stopped gossiping about the dissolution and started watching this courtship with the uncomplicated pleasure that communities take in a romance that was clearly always going to happen. Ruth Calloway told Cora over tea in February of 1879 that the general opinion of the town was that it was about time. Grace Finney said she had known from the first week that Cora arrived that something was going to happen between those two, because the way Amos Doyle looked at Cora when she wasn't looking was the way men looked at things they were afraid to want too much. Grace's opinion gave Cora pause. She asked Amos about it one evening when they were sitting on the porch of the Double D, having progressed by February to the point where she visited the ranch on Sunday afternoons, wrapped in borrowed blankets and drinking coffee in the winter air. She asked him if it was true that he had looked at her like that from the beginning. He was quiet for a moment, which she had learned to recognize as genuine thought rather than evasion, and then he said, "From the first Thursday. When you told me you could put in an order for the cartridges if I left my name. You were so completely composed and so completely sure of yourself, and I thought, who is this woman and how do I make her stay in Myra Creek?" She laughed, an actual laugh surprised out of her. "You were thinking that at the supply counter." "I was thinking that at the supply counter," he said. "And then I told myself I was being ridiculous and you were a store clerk and I was being dramatic. And I went home and thought about it for a week." He looked at her with a small, wry expression. "I was already too far gone before the storm. The storm just confirmed it." "Why didn't you say anything?" she said. "Before San Antonio. Why didn't you?" "Because I was proud," he said, "and afraid, and convinced that what I felt wasn't manageable, that if I said it out loud and it didn't work, the thing it would damage in me would be something I couldn't rebuild." He looked at the dark Texas sky above the Double D, the stars enormous and close at this distance from town. "I was wrong about that too. The damage from not saying it was considerably worse." "Yes," she said, "it was." He reached over in the winter night on the porch of his ranch and took her hand. She let him. She felt the warmth of his hand through both their gloves, and the rightness of it was so complete and so uncomplicated that she thought she might cry, which she did not, because she was Cora Hart and she had her dignity. She did squeeze his hand back very firmly. He proposed in March of 1879, on a Sunday afternoon at the Double D, in the room he called his study, a room she had come to love for its shelves of worn books and its fire and its smell of wood smoke and leather, and the particular order of a man who knew exactly where everything was. He did it without ceremony, which was entirely characteristic, simply turning to her in the middle of a conversation about whether the spring grass was coming in better on the east pasture than it had the year before, and saying, "Cora, will you marry me? I want you here. I want you in this house and on this land and in this life for all of it. Everything I have is yours if you'll have it. Will you have it?" She looked at him. She had been waiting for this, had known it was coming, had known her answer for longer than she had known how to admit, and still the moment it arrived she felt it like the first warm day after a very long winter, sudden and total and full of light. "Yes," she said. He smiled then, not the slight, contained smile that she had catalogued. A real smile, full and warm and entirely unguarded, the smile that was underneath all the pride and all the control, the smile that was the real Amos Doyle when he let everything else fall away. She had seen it only a few times in 4 years, and each time it had struck her like a physical thing, and she thought she would spend the rest of her life working to see it as often as possible. They were married in April of 1879, in the small church in Myra Creek, by the same reverend who had conducted both previous ceremonies in that church involving the two of them separately. And the whole town came, and Webb closed the store for the afternoon, and Ruth and Grace stood at the front with barely contained smiles, and Henry Marsh was not in attendance because he had moved to Austin in January for a new position at a law firm there. And Cora thought of him briefly and sincerely wished him well and hoped he would find what he was looking for. The ceremony was brief and direct, which suited them both, and when it was done and she was Mrs. Cora Doyle, and his hand was warm around hers as they walked down the church aisle into the Texas spring sunshine. She felt something in her interior cabinet close permanently, not because she was putting something away, but because something was resolved, complete. She was not a woman standing at the edge of a feeling, carefully managing her distance from it. She was standing inside it fully, and it was exactly as whole and as terrifying and as right as she had believed it would be. The double D became hers as much as his in the years that followed, not just legally but in the way that a place becomes a person's through work and knowledge, and the slow accumulation of love for a particular piece of earth. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the seasons of cattle ranching, the spring calving and the summer drives and the autumn accounting and the long work of winter maintenance, and she brought to all of it the same organized, capable mind she had brought to the dry goods store, and within a year she was managing the ranch accounts with an efficiency that Amos acknowledged, with characteristic directness, was considerably better than his own. She also kept reading. They both did. On winter evenings when the work was done and the fire was banked and the house was quiet, they read, sometimes to each other, and those evenings were some of the richest of her life. Those evenings in the study with the lamplight and the fire and his voice reading something that mattered and then stopping to discuss it with the complete engagement that she had loved in him from the very first conversation. They fought, as Ruth had predicted. Cora Hart, Cora Doyle now, was not a gentle woman when she was angry, and the capacity for clear, direct speech that made her an excellent businesswoman also made her a formidable opponent in an argument. And there were arguments in the early years that were loud enough to send the ranch hands conspicuously elsewhere for the duration. Amos had kept his promise about staying in the room, though it cost him something every time. She could see it costing him, could see the pride that wanted to close him off and the effort of will it took to keep himself open. She gave him credit for that. She tried to give him time when she could see him struggling, without giving him so much time that the moment passed unexplored. They became very good, over the years, at fighting honestly and making up thoroughly, and she discovered that making up with Amos Doyle after a real argument was one of the more pleasant experiences available to a person in the territory of Texas. Their first child was born in the spring of 1880, a boy they named James William Doyle, for Amos's father, who had been the first man to put a plow in the Double D's soil, and for the sheer sound of it, which Cora liked. James was dark-haired like his father and had his mother's direct eyes, and from his first weeks on earth, appeared to approach everything with the organized curiosity that Cora recognized as her own characteristic, and that Amos observed with a satisfaction that was both proud and clearly emotional, even though he expressed the emotional part by going outside and staring at the horizon for 10 minutes and coming back looking carefully composed. She told him she noticed. He said nothing. She took his hand and he held it, and that was enough. The Double D expanded in those years, acquiring 2 additional parcels of land to the south and increasing the herd substantially. Amos had good instincts for the cattle business, and the patience that long-term operations required, and Cora had the head for accounts and planning that complemented his range sense perfectly. They were a better operation together than either had been separately, and the other ranchers in the county acknowledged this in the way frontier people acknowledge things, by asking for their opinion at the Cattlemen's Association meetings and by doing business with them consistently. They also employed fairly. This was something Cora had strong opinions about, and Amos had proved surprisingly aligned with her on, not out of idealism alone, but out of the practical conviction that men who were treated well worked better and stayed longer. Their ranch hands were paid on time and in full, given adequate time off, and treated with the respect owed to working people. This was not universal in the cattle country of 1880, and it made the Double D a place where good workers came and stayed, which made everything else possible. Ruth and her husband James Calloway came to supper at the Double D regularly throughout those years, and Grace Finney too when she wasn't in session, and the friendships that Cora had built in her single years deepened and became the kind of friendships that sustained a person through everything, through the dry years and the hard seasons and the losses that came, as they always came, to anyone who lived a full life. Their second child arrived in the spring of 1882, a girl this time, a fierce and impatient infant who screamed with great authority from her first moments, and who Cora looked at with the recognition of kinship. They named her Eleanor Ruth Eleanor because they both liked it, Ruth for Cora's dearest friend, who wiped her own eyes at the naming and said she was not crying at all, and then went outside and came back with her eyes notably red. James Doyle, 2 years old and deeply opinionated about the household's established order, regarded his sister with suspicion for approximately 3 weeks and then became her devoted champion for the rest of his childhood. Amos watched his son defend his baby sister against imaginary threats in the yard, with an expression that Cora had learned to read as the deep satisfaction of a man who understood that he had, against all the odds of his own stubbornness, arrived somewhere worth being. She told him so one evening in their study, after both children were in bed and the fire was low, and the quiet of the house was the comfortable kind, the kind that comes from fullness rather than emptiness. "You look like you know you're happy," she said. He looked up from the book in his lap. "What does that look like?" he asked. "Like someone who spent a long time not trusting it," she said, "and has finally stopped arguing with the evidence." He smiled, the full smile. "I spent a long time doing things wrong," he said. "It takes a while to believe you're doing something right." "Are you?" she said. "Yes," he said without hesitation, which was itself significant because Amos Doyle was not a man who said things without thinking them. "I am." She set down her own book and crossed the room and sat beside him on the settee, which had come from San Antonio and was rather nicer than anything else in the room, a concession he had made to her comfort, and that she thanked him for every time she sat on it. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they sat in the firelight in the comfortable silence of two people who had found their way to each other through an extraordinary amount of complication, and were not taking a single quiet evening for granted. There was one thing during those years that Cora felt needed to be properly addressed, and she addressed it in the spring of 1881, when she wrote a letter to Henry Marsh in Austin. Not a long letter, not an emotionally complicated one, but a real letter thanking him for his honesty and his dignity in one of the hardest situations a person could be in, and wishing him genuine happiness, and saying that she hoped the world had been good to him. He wrote back 2 months later. He had, it turned out, met a woman in Austin, a widow named Clara, a schoolteacher with 3 children and a practical turn of mind, and they had married the previous fall, and he said with the careful directness that had always characterized him, happier than he had expected to be and grateful for a life that had arranged itself differently than planned. He wished Cora well. He said he was glad to know she was in a good place. She showed the letter to Amos. He read it and was quiet for a moment and then said, "He's a genuinely decent man." "He is," she said. "I owe him something," Amos said, "for being the kind of man he was." "You owe him nothing except the hope that his life is good," she said, "which it apparently is." "Then I hope it," Amos said simply, and meant it, and that was that. The years of the early 1880s were good years on the Texas range, before the hard droughts and the long winters that would come later in the decade. And the Double D grew, and Amos and Cora grew with it, into themselves and into each other, becoming the kind of couple that newcomers in Myra Creek pointed to as evidence that the West was a place where real, lasting things could be built. The town itself was growing, getting paved streets and a proper schoolhouse and a newspaper and the beginnings of a genuine civic identity. And the Double D was part of its backbone, which Amos wore with a pride that no longer looked like armor. It was a different kind of pride than the one Cora had first observed in him across the store counter. Not the pride of a man defending something he was afraid to lose, but the pride of a man who had made something real and knew exactly what it had cost and what it was worth. She understood this distinction. She had come to understand most of him over these years, the way you understand a piece of country when you have lived in it long enough. Not perfectly, not every corner, but deeply enough that you move through it with confidence and love its particular character, even when it's difficult. She loved him on the easy days and on the difficult ones. She loved him when he was proud and when the pride made him hard to reach, and on those occasions she reached through it anyway, with the directness she had promised herself in November of 1878, and she made him talk and they worked it out. She loved him in the big obvious moments and in the small ones, the way he brought her coffee in the morning before she was fully awake, the way he still read to her in the evenings after years of evenings, the way he knew without being told when she was tired, and came to find her in the middle of whatever she was doing and said, "Let's sit down for a while," and meant it as a genuine offer of rest. In the fall of 1883, when James was 3 and Alina was 1, and the house at the Double D was full and noisy, and completely different from the silent place it had been when she first visited it in that autumn of 1875, Cora Doyle discovered she was expecting a third child. And she told Amos about it in the study at the end of a long day, and watched the man who had once been so carefully composed go completely soft around the eyes in the way he only did when something moved him past the point of his own management. He pulled her close and held her for a long time without saying anything, and she could feel the size of what he felt in the steadiness of his arms. "Third time," she said against his shoulder. "Third time," he said. "Are you all right?" "I'm wonderful," she said. "I'm quite genuinely wonderful." Their third child arrived in the spring of 1884, a second son, born at dawn on an April morning when the bluebonnets were coming up across the east pasture, a loud and healthy boy who came into the world announcing himself and never really stopped. They named him Robert, for no particular reason except that both of them liked the sound of it on its own, without needing to attach it to a history. Just Robert Doyle, belonging entirely to himself and to them, and to the Double D. James, now 4, greeted his new brother with the air of a young man who had been preparing for this responsibility, and was ready to take it seriously. Alina, too, greeted him by pointing at him from a distance, and then going back to whatever she had been doing, which Amos found so characteristic of her mother's self-possession that he told Cora about it in the middle of the night when they were both lying awake in the way new parents lie awake, and the house was quiet, and the baby was sleeping, and everything was as good as things get. She listened to him tell it and she laughed, softly so as not to wake anyone, and he laughed too, and they lay in the dark of the Double D on a spring night in 1884, and listened to the ranch they had built together settling in the night air. And Cora thought about everything. The storm in August of 1875, and the Thursday afternoons and the ache of the years between and the fence on an October evening, and his voice cracking on "Tell me I am not too late," and all of it led here. To this room and this man, and 3 children sleeping in the rooms down the hall, and the spring smell of Texas coming through the open window. She had never expected, at 22 on a westbound stage from Memphis with one trunk and no particular optimism, to find a life this full. Amos turned his head toward her in the dark, and even without seeing his face clearly she knew his expression, knew the exact texture of the quietness that was contentment rather than distance. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered. "I'm thinking," she said, "that you should have come to the fence sooner." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the slight lift in his voice that meant the contained smile, "I know," he said. "But," she said. "But," he said. "But I think we had to go through all of it," she said. "Every bit. The storm and the Thursdays and the autumn and the catastrophic 3 years of waiting and the fence and all of it. I think we had to go through it to get here with everything we know about each other, because we know a great deal, Amos." He was quiet again, thinking, not hiding. She could tell the difference. "We do," he said. "So I'm not grateful for the pain," she said carefully, "but I am grateful for what it made us. Does that make sense?" "Yes," he said, "perfect sense." She settled into her pillow. Outside, a night bird called once and went quiet. The ranch was still. Down the hall, Robert made a small, contented sound in his sleep. "Amos," she said. He said. "The next time you are afraid of something important," she said, "you will say so." "Yes," he said. Immediately, she said. "Cora," he said. "I mean it," she said. "I know you do," he said. "I will." She closed her eyes. She felt the warmth of him beside her and the weight of the good life around her, and she thought, as she was falling into sleep, that the West was a particular kind of place, harsh and beautiful and full of the possibility of real things, things that lasted, built by people stubborn enough to stay through the hard parts. She was, she thought, exactly stubborn enough. The Double D in the years that followed became what Amos had always believed it could be. One of the finest operations in the county, well managed and well regarded, built on honest work and honest dealing, and known throughout the Myra Creek district as a place that ran straight. The cattle were good and the grass was managed carefully, and the men who worked there stayed because they were treated as people rather than tools, and the accounts were in order because Cora ran them, and the reputation was solid because both of them lived the same way privately as publicly, which in the West was considered the highest possible praise. James grew into a boy who was interested in everything, the land and the cattle and the books and the world beyond Texas that he read about in the study his parents had made a place of learning as much as rest. Alina grew into a girl of fierce opinions and remarkable organizational talent, who at age 7 was already alphabetizing the household books and had told the ranch foreman at least twice that a particular process was inefficient, and here was how she thought it should be done, and was correct both times, which the foreman acknowledged without quite knowing how to process the information. Robert grew into himself, loud and warm and a little reckless, with his mother's straight-on manner and his father's fundamental stubbornness, and the combination was both exhausting and wonderful. Myra Creek grew, too, as the decade turned, from a cattle town into something closer to a real town, with a proper 2-story schoolhouse, and a church that had been expanded twice, and a newspaper that covered the county, and a doctor's office that was separate from Ruth and James Calloway's home, now that James had 2 young partners in the practice. The land office handled claims and disputes with increasing complexity as the population grew, and Henry's old law office had been taken over by a woman named Abigail Morse, which caused more conversation in town than Cora thought was warranted, given that Abigail was plainly excellent at her work and should have been left to it. She said this at the Cattlemen's Association meeting in the spring of 1886, when the discussion about Miss Morse's appointment to a land dispute committee became more heated than the actual land dispute warranted, and the room went quiet in the particular way rooms went quiet when Cora Doyle said something direct. And Amos caught her eye from across the room with an expression she read clearly as both pride and the private acknowledgement that he had spent 11 years learning this woman and was still regularly surprised by her. She gave him a slight look in return and went back to the business of the meeting. The spring of 1887 brought a late freeze that hit the range hard, damaging the winter wheat and stressing the younger cattle in the Double D herd, and there were difficult months of recovery and recalculation. Amos worked 17-hour days for most of April and May, and Cora worked alongside him, not on the physical range work but in the accounts, finding savings and rescheduling payments, and corresponding with their bank in San Antonio with the kind of precise, determined negotiation that had kept more than one frontier operation from going under during a bad season. They came through it. Not without cost, but intact, and on the other side of it Amos sat down at the kitchen table one evening in June with the final accounts in front of him and looked at what the numbers said and then looked at Cora and said, "You saved this place this spring." "We saved it," she said. "Your accounts saved it," he said. "The numbers don't lie. The numbers also show that your decisions about which cattle to hold and which to sell in February were the reason we had the foundation to save," she said. "Don't be modest on my behalf. Take the credit that's yours." He smiled, the full one. "I was trying to give you credit. Give us both credit," she said. "That's the actual truth." He reached across the table and took her hand, right there over the account books in the kitchen in the June evening, and she looked at his hand and then at his face and thought, "This is it. This is the thing. Not the fence or the storm or the courtship, though all of those mattered. This. Two people who built something real and knew what it cost and held it together with both hands." "I love you," he said, "not as an event, just as a statement of fact." "I know," she said. "I love you too." And the evening went on, and the accounts were filed, and the supper was made, and the children came in from the yard, and the Double D settled into its summer rhythms, and it was an ordinary evening in all the ways that mattered most. In the fall of 1887, 12 years after Cora Hart had stepped off the westbound stage in Myra Creek with one trunk and a letter of employment and no particular plan, she stood on the porch of the Double D Ranch house on a Thursday evening, because it had been a Thursday all those years ago too, and she liked the symmetry of it, and watched her 3 children in the yard below. James, 7 now, showing his brother Robert, 3, how to properly hold a stick in a way that did not endanger anyone in his vicinity. Eleanor, 5, ignoring both of them and reading a book she had found somewhere, sitting cross-legged in the dry grass with the absorbed expression of a person who has found their natural habitat. Amos came out of the house and stood beside her and followed her gaze to the children and then to the range that stretched out beyond them in the long afternoon light, the Double D going to the horizon and past it, all of it real and built and theirs. "Thursday," she said. He looked at her, a little quizzically. "I first walked into the store on a Thursday," she said. "You came in for salt and hobble straps." He was quiet for a moment. "And cartridges," he said. "I needed cartridges ordered." "You absolutely did not need cartridges," she said. He smiled. "No," he said. "I didn't." She laughed. Softly, fully, with the ease of a woman who had earned the right to laugh at the long, complicated road that had brought her to this porch in this light with this man. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and below them in the yard James was teaching Robert something with great seriousness, and Eleanor had not looked up from her book, and the range went on forever, and the sky was enormous, and the Double D stood solid in the Texas afternoon, built on everything they had made together. The mistakes and the courage and the years of careful Thursday conversations and one desperate man at a fence with his heart in his hand saying words he should have said long before. She had told him he was not too late. She had told him with her whole life, with everything she had built and fought for and chosen every day since, that he was not too late. And here they stood in the evidence of it on a Thursday evening on the range, in the long gold light of a Texas October, with the work of their life in every direction they looked. She reached up and took his hand where it rested on her shoulder, fitting her fingers through his, and held on. He held on too. That was how it was. That was how it would be. The ranch and the children and the books in the study and the honest arguments and the long evenings and the Thursday mornings and every season after this one, stretching forward into a future that belonged entirely to them, built on everything they had finally, completely, entirely stopped being afraid to want. Cora Doyle, who had stepped off a westbound stage in 1875 with no particular optimism, looked out at her particular piece of Texas and found it to be more than enough. More than she had dreamed on that first day in the dust and the noise and the newness of Myra Creek. More than enough for a whole life and then some. And Amos Doyle, who had ridden 60 miles without stopping and arrived at a white fence with his voice cracking, and his pride finally and completely set aside, stood beside her in the last of the afternoon light and felt, for the first time in his adult life, that he was standing precisely where he was supposed to be. The mockingbird in the cedar tree by the porch fence sang 3 notes and then kept going, filling the autumn air with its unending song, because that was the thing about mockingbirds in Texas. Once they started, they did not easily stop, and they were very good at what they did. Robert Doyle toddled over to the porch steps and looked up at his parents with the imperious expression of a 3-year-old who has decided he requires attention. And Amos released Cora's hand and went down the steps to scoop his youngest son up. And the boy shrieked with delight and grabbed his father's hat off his head and put it on his own, where it fell immediately over his eyes. And Amos's laugh rang out across the ranch yard, and James came running to see what was happening, and Alina looked up from her book with temporary interest before returning to it. And Cora stood on the porch and watched all of them in the last of the light, and thought that this was the best possible life. Not because it was easy, but because it was real, and she had been brave enough and stubborn enough and honest enough to step into it fully, and so had he, even if it had taken him a little longer. That was all right. She had waited. She was very glad she had.